Hello and welcome to our presentation, Update the Path to Brexit. This webinar is a part of a series we are giving to help business owners understand how and when Brexit will affect doing business in the UK and beyond. The webinar is a collaboration between Citrin Cooperman and Moore Stephens, our international association, who we work with constantly on many joint projects and clients. So I am Mark Fagan, Citrin Cooperman Managing Partner of Norwalk, Connecticut, and co-leader of the International Strategy Group. Joining me today will be John Stanford of Moore Stephens London, Director of Consulting Services and Chair of Moore Stephens Brexit Work Group. So the objectives of this webinar is to get an update of our Brexit timetable, the price of Brexit, how the economy is doing right now in the UK and what type of influences that could have on Brexit, the customs union, the Irish border, and citizens' rights. So John, could you give us an update of the timetable that we talked about in our last webinar?
Of course. Hi, Mark. Since the referendum in June 2016, the next step was to kickstart the formal exit process, which the government actually got underway in March last year. And if you remember, under the Lisbon Treaty, the UK then triggered Article 50, which essentially started the two-year exit process. Preconditions were to be met before formal negotiations could start, and those included citizens' rights, the Irish border, and then the cost of exiting the EU, or what's been called the divorce bill. We're now in the period of 10 months of negotiating across all those complex areas of withdrawal from the EU, and by which time we then have to provide a full deal or details of the deal to the EU Parliament in October later on this year. After that point, then the Parliament, together with the EU Council, have to agree the terms of the deal through the ratification process. And if all of that is okay, we then get the UK government presenting the bill to the UK Parliament in March next year, at which point that will then signify the end of the process, if that's agreed, of course. I suppose the difference since the last time we spoke is that there's now a transition period that's been defined. This follows after March 2019 and up to the point of December 2020, that will allow both parties to work through all the regulations, the agreements, policies, etc., that need to be ironed out, and that's about it.
So, John, the process, from what I've heard, hasn't been very efficient, and now where we are today, being May 9th, what are the chances of making the October deadline that you just spoke about?
Well, there's certainly an awful lot to do. We're deep now into the negotiations. A lot of that formal period from a few months ago, where we had to agree certain positions so the negotiations could start. We've now got underway with that, and it's into the detail of the trade negotiations. A lot of that's going to depend on the points that we raised about agreeing citizens' rights, and in particular the most contentious issue, which is the Irish border. You could easily see that the various parties involved in that, if they don't agree it, if only one of them just pulls out, then yeah, we'll be in a situation where no deal will actually get agreed. And in fact, there is this mantra that is sent out by all parties that says there is no deal until everything's agreed.
In that agreement, is there a formal process as how you go about dealing with disagreement, whether it be the amount of the divorce bill or any other
Well,
on this?
Well, I think in particular we're seeing it around the customs union at the moment, or the questions around the customs. As we'll discuss later on, there's a couple of options that are on the table, but in fact they were on the table in August last year, and they were, if you like, rebuffed by the EU then, and they've been rebuffed by the EU again now. And even within the Conservative-led government here, they can't agree amongst themselves. So at the moment, it doesn't look good. But the point is, everybody is still talking. So whilst they're talking, there's always hope.
Okay. And I guess what everyone's concerned about is the price of Brexit. Now that there's been some time that's passed, I'm sure that there's been a lot of study on this.
There has, and in fact, even into last year, it wasn't until towards the end of the year that the government actually recognised that it had undertaken a number of impact studies, as it was referred to then, which they hadn't actually released. They hadn't published it, so nobody knew what they were thinking. But even then, they hadn't actually calculated the various options themselves. So what we've got here on this slide is examples of 4 different types of options, and none of them make particularly great reading, to be honest. So in the first instance, let's look at what's termed a bespoke deal. This is where there's been the phrase or the clause cherry picking. It's this idea of Britain wanting its cake and eating it. And they're basically saying, yes, we like many of the bits of the current deal we've got with the EU. We'll keep those, but the bits we don't like, we'll throw them away. And of course, the EU is saying, no, you won't. You take it all, you take nothing. But essentially, the various sort of budgetary commissions have had a look through the detail behind it. And as with any deal, there's an upside and there's a downside. And if we have a look at the bespoke deal at the moment, there's a 67 billion downside to this. That's covering things to deal with the cost of non-tariff barriers, the inclusion of custom barriers, the divorce payments, that divorce bill that I was talking about earlier on. And of course, whilst this is continuing, we are actually still making contributions to the EU. In itself, those custom barriers, divorce payments, ongoing contributions would add 38 billion onto the bill. Final one is free movement of people. That would make a dent in the economy by another 6 billion. So that's the downside. The plus side is that the bespoke deal could bring in something in the region of 27 billion extra into the treasury from things like customs revenue or EU budgetary savings. Net cost 40 billion. But in terms that we can perhaps better understand, it comes to something in the region of 615 million per week. Okay, is that a lot or not? I don't know. But if you cast your mind back, if there was ever that image of the Brexiteers, those who were really for exiting the EU, they were talking about, they showed this bus, this London bus, and plastered across the side of it was exiting the EU will bring £350 million per week extra cash into our National Health Service. Whereas you can see, having a look at a bespoke deal, far from bringing 350 million in, we're actually going to be giving away another 615. So not really going to be working too well. I mean, what are the others? I mean, I won't go through the same sort of detail, but essentially Norway is part of the economic area. And essentially what it's done is to say, yes, we want access to the single market, but we don't want to be controlled by the EU. So what they do is they pay for that access to the single market, but have no say over the various policies. That's been equated as being something similar to 260 million a week. Then there's the Canadian deal. That was more of a bespoke deal, but it was focused around goods more than services, only some services in there. Net cost, 877 million. But look at that one at the bottom there, the no deal. If we don't strike a deal and therefore fall back into World Trade Organization rules, we could be looking at a net cost to the UK of 1.25 billion a week. I mean, these are mouth-watering figures, aren't they? Not mouth-watering, eye-watering. They're terrible, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I think, the final point to make is that when they did all this costing, they actually did a survey of something in the region of 2,000 people, and 72% of leavers, so those people who voted to leave, actually thought that 615 million a week was too high a price to pay. So what are they saying? Essentially, they're saying to the government, go back and start thinking again and start negotiating harder.
And that gets back to what the referendum was in my mind. It was a protest. To me, it was a protest vote versus an economic decision. And those can have dire consequences when you start putting pen to paper and understanding what the real cost and real effects is going to be. to
Yeah.
making this. All right, that's John. That's an incredible amount of negative news, and with each option being a cost versus a savings. So, if all of these options result in the UK being in a worse position, are there discussions to reverse the Brexit referendum?
Good question, Mark. I think it's a case of there are always discussions. There are always people with opposing views, and certainly the press likes to stir it quite a bit over here, as I'm sure the press likes to stir things in the US as well. But I think it unlikely that there would be a straight referendum vote in the same way with the same question being asked. I think the main reason for that is likely to be the fact that the current Conservative government came into power with Brexit as part of the manifesto. It was actually saying we've taken a decision through the previous referendum to leave the customs union, to leave the single market, and that's what we intend to do. So I think for that reason alone, it's unlikely that there would be another vote to actually say, should we actually leave the EU? The only thing that is likely to happen, the only thing that's really changed recently, is the fact that there were discussions that the government itself could actually take a decision. When it puts the deal together and it agrees it with the EU, it could then take an arbitrary decision to say, right, that's it, we're leaving. It can't do that now. It actually has an amendment, if you like, to the withdrawal bill has gone through, such that it must now refer to the wider UK Parliament. So there must be a debate about it. Okay, is the UK Parliament going to turn around and go, well, actually, we vote against it, so now you go back to basics and renegotiate? Yeah, that's a very good possibility that could happen. But that's the only difference now, and that's the only way that this situation would change.
And it's an amazing example of how you've got a protest vote. And that's really what I saw Brexit as, is a protest vote, not a clear decision to make a choice based on economics and other salient factors. And and given that, and given we've talked about this in the first webinar, that the Brexit meant uncertainty in its outset, and still does mean uncertainty as we go through this process. Uncertainty for business is usually something that's negative. Right now in the States,
Yeah.
we've got a pretty good economic situation with our stock market's been a little volatile, but our economy is cooking along pretty well. What about in the UK? How is Brexit affecting the economy?
Well, I won't take that as the US rubbing it into the UK, but thanks for that, Mark. Yes, the economy, actually, it's shaping up fairly well. It is holding up there, but I think to an extent, you've got to consider, are some of the figures actually just sort of masking what will be the inevitable? So if we look at things, and you mentioned the US in particular, but generally world growth over the past 2 or 3 years has been strong. But Britain's growth during the same period has certainly not matched that. And indeed, in the last 12 months, I understand that growth in the UK has actually been half of its own average over the previous 25 years. So it clearly isn't making as much as it possibly could do when the rest of the world is kind of booming. And in particular, if I look at the first quarter of this year, Britain's growth rate was at the lowest rate that it has actually been in any other time for the last 5 years. So it's not sounding too hot, is it? But the UK over the last 12, 18 months has been bouncing in and out of recession. But this is kind of seen by those Brexiteers, those people who are the ardent leavers, as it were. It's just been seen as some sort of frictional difficulty ahead of what they kind of see as the utopia, if you like, the heady heights of the plethora of trade deals that they suggest that we're actually going to be getting from the faster growing economies such as Asia, for example. I mean, it's interesting to see how it's going to go, but at the moment, the economy doesn't look too bad.
Hmm. And what are some of the key considerations that are attributing to this?
Yeah, there's lots of discussion around. I mean, unemployment, as I've listed there as the first bullet point, unemployment's actually at its lowest point that it's been for 40 years. So you won't hear many people who are the Remainers saying, pointing that particular fact out. But I think the other factors, other areas that UK has particularly been strong in the past are things like the high tech industry. And Britain had hoped for something in the region of something like 40 billion as its share, if you like, of the space industry by 2030. And it's got certain EU projects such as the Galileo satellite projects and Copernicus. In particular, Galileo was one where we were going to be building in use of our encryption technologies for moving government data around from one satellite to another. I mean, I know that's all getting a bit technical, but that's a massive investment that was going to be made and a huge contribution that was going to be made by the UK. But we're now kind of isolated from that. It's almost dead in the water. So the tech industry is certainly not dead, but those particular large sort of scale EU type projects are certainly in doubt, if not dead themselves. And I mean, we kind of have to remember that currently that we're at the heart of one of the world's, if not the world's greatest free trade area. There are 27 other EU countries. There are 31 other countries with which the EU has made free trade agreements. And there are another 30 that is well on the way to sort of negotiating this. I mean, how can we, what chance does the UK have of producing something of that scale on its own? I'm not sure if it can do. But going back to the unemployment point, just finally, having said that it's at its lowest position that it has been for 40 odd years, it's also what's known as a lag indicator. It's not something that's representative of where we are right now. It's representative of where we were 12 months ago. So if you put all the things that I'm talking about now into context, potentially if we came back and had another chat, Mark, in 12 months' time, I might be looking at unemployment figures that are vastly different to what we're talking about now.
In something like Brexit, and we've seen it with other things in business, it's a distraction. It's a distraction from the activities and the effort that needs to occur to produce a strong economy. So it makes sense that it would be a negative factor. But let's talk about some positives.
Yeah, I've kind of been a bit negative so far, haven't I? I think at the moment, if we're looking at something like an independent trading relationship, it can be made to work, but it will take time. And again, I try desperately to get in my role in the Brexit work group to get a balanced view. It's very difficult when you get people sort of giving you the figures that point to doom, but there aren't too many who are actually saying it's going to be positive. But however, let's look at one or two here. So 30% of British food at the moment is imported from mainland Europe, and that equates to something like a 10 billion pound surplus of food that's actually traded. So what's that made up of? There's a 4 billion surplus from France coming to the UK, 3 billion from Spain, and similar, another 3 billion from Italy. Those countries are hardly going to shoot themselves in the foot and start imposing tariffs on food when we're such a massive market for them, because potentially we'll go and look elsewhere. But I mean, if we look at the fact that we're compliant with EU standards at the moment, and we've made a stated aim that we're going to continue to do that. So if we adopt the EU standards and couple that with regulatory compliance and looking at the fact that hopefully there will be no tariffs, certainly in some sectors, what does that mean? There'll be perhaps checks at the points of departure and arrival, but not at the ports. Then hopefully we'll be in the situation where we won't have food rotting at the terminals, if you like. So hopefully there are some positives there, and that we can actually work with the EU to appeal to maybe their better nature, and I'm sure they do have one, and that we'll end up with a much more satisfactory situation. The other one is maybe looking at the fact that there is actually a lower risk to the city than people were suggesting beforehand. There were figures thrown around of something like 20,000 people who were going to suddenly be hemorrhaged from the London businesses and go across into the EU. Well, those figures have been downplayed and downgraded several times. And I think at the moment, the last one I heard was saying, oh, it might be somewhere in the region of about 500. Well, okay, that's nowhere near so bad. But at the moment, the view tends to be in the city that there isn't another European city that can replicate the depth of capital, liquidity, and general expertise in financial markets that we currently have in London. So yes, some jobs may actually move, but London's growth and importance will continue. At least that's the view. And I think, despite my negativity in some aspects of this discussion, I am actually somebody who kind of feels, well, come on, let's get on with it. Let's make it work. And I think there is a bit of a call that's saying, come on, business and government work together, reduce the negativity, because otherwise that's going to hold us back. But we've got plenty to work on.
Right. Yeah. And that makes sense because we had talked about this previously in the first webinar as who is going to be the city that jumps up and says, come to us. Would it have been someone in Ireland or Germany? But right now you really haven't seen that.
No, they haven't been given the chance yet at the moment. There are certainly a lot of dissenting voices, but at the same time, point I made earlier on, they are still talking, and that's the great thing. It's not as if everybody's given up hope. I think they're saying, yeah, whilst there's talking, there's hope. So hopefully that'll be the way it'll go.
Great. So let's jump over to customs. We've spoken about the customs in the past and how that's one of the key issues to Brexit. What is the customs union, if we can understand that?
Yeah, sure. So a customs union is essentially it's a trade agreement of two parts. So in the first instance, both parties agree that they will not charge tariffs or import duties on each other's goods. Secondly, they then agree that they will charge the same tariffs as each other on imports from other countries. So it also means, unfortunately, it also means that members cannot therefore negotiate their own free trade agreements elsewhere. And it's that last point that's the issue for the UK. So they're very happy to have tariff-free exchange of goods. That's not a problem. But they also want to have the ability to control their own destiny, if you like, and strike up FTAs with other countries outside of the EU.
And what's the UK's position on customs after Brexit?
Yeah, well, if it's not going to do a customs union, what is it going to do? So there are two options on the table. Interestingly, both of these have been discussed in some shape or form since last August, rejected by the EU then and kind of rejected by them now. But again, they are starting to morph, and hopefully we'll get them into some sort of shape that we can take forward. So the first of these is something that's referred to as the customs partnership. The idea behind this is it's kind of giving us the best of both worlds. It's giving us a frictionless trade between the UK and the EU, yet it's allowing the UK the freedom to set its own tariffs. The plan is therefore for British customs authorities to charge whatever's the higher of the British or the EU tariff on the goods that are entering the country. It then tracks them electronically through to their destination where the goods are going to end up. So if the goods then end up in a country with a lower tariff, you essentially calculate the difference, and the importing firm would then claim a refund for the difference. It's a bit like a delayed rebate almost, if you like. But that would of course mean that goods can travel across the borders relatively, friction free, if you like. The second option is one that's referred to, it's got different varying names. So it's a highly streamed customs arrangement, which is known as maximum facilitation, or if you're kind of hip and trendy, which of course I am, it's max fac. And what does that mean? This one's very technologically based. It's a plan for using technology to manage the checks rather than eliminating them. So the UK and the EU would share data and intelligence to kind of reduce the bureaucracy, with more businesses operating as trusted traders. In particular, that's those sort of traders that regularly move from A to B. And so they would actually declare their paperwork beforehand and clarify it at a later date, rather than stopping at the border every time and having to sort of submit paperwork then. So it would allow them to effectively settle their duties at regular intervals, rather than every time they moved goods across the border.
Interesting. It's going to be it's going to be very detailed to follow through and to track all that, but it sounds like it'd be more efficient for sure.
Hopefully so, but you've got to realise that the EU's objection, they've actually referred in particular to the customs partnership as magical thinking. I think the in essence they were talking about it would take about 3 years to sort the technology and everything out for the customs partnership, and 5 years for the max fac approach. Because the fact is, it doesn't affect just the UK and their movement of goods. It also affects other ports like Rotterdam, like maybe Calais as well, like Dublin. They're going to have to implement the same sort of procedures on the other side of the EU fence, as it were.
Well, John, speaking of Ireland, would a customs union solve the Irish border issue?
In a word, no, but it would help certainly. I mentioned earlier on in December last year, the UK and the EU agreed. I mean, it was a little bit of a fudge the way they got to the point of saying, okay, we've agreed on things like citizens' rights and movement of people and things like that, and they had to agree what they were going to do with Ireland, and they came up with these kind of vague words that said that there will be no physical infrastructure or related checks and controls. Well, that sounds specific and explicit, but it doesn't explain how they're going to do it. So they said that will be the situation with regards to Ireland as a result of Brexit. But okay, a customs union eliminates the needs for checks on the origin of goods passing between Northern Ireland and the Republic, but it will also mean less paperwork for businesses on both sides of the border. So yeah, if there were different regulations on either side, as there undoubtedly will be, then the checks will still be needed to ensure that the goods crossing over were compliant. So it's not going to stop it completely, but it would certainly help.
So could they look to others? Like, for instance, I know that other countries outside of the EU have arrangements. Does anyone else have a customs union with the EU, and is it working for them?
I suppose Turkey has been in a customs union with the EU since '95, but it's pretty unsatisfied with the state of things at the moment. The reason for that being, as you say, it's kind of outside the EU, but it's bound by the trade agreements that the EU negotiates. But it gets very little say on EU trade policy. And worse than that still is that if there is a new EU trade agreement, which perhaps increased access for European companies to the market of another country, Turkey doesn't automatically get that access, even though it actually still has to open up its own market to that new partner. So it doesn't sound like they're getting a very good deal out of that, and certainly no chance to have a say.
So just jumping back to the Irish border, and we had talked about this previously, that it's the one area where Brexit comes into play with a land border. And this is a great image here that you have, and especially for people in the States to really understand the dynamics of the EU and how it's being depicted and how it exists in Ireland versus the UK.
Mm.
So what's the situation with Ireland and Northern Ireland right now?
Okay, yeah. So I mean, with regards to the map we've put up there, I mean, a lot of these words tend to be interchangeable. You know, Great Britain, United Kingdom, etc. But you can see, hopefully, the map is identifying the fact that Northern Ireland is actually part of the United Kingdom, along with Scotland, England, and Wales. And you've got that border, as you say, between it and the Republic of Ireland. What is it? It's a 310-mile long border. It's often winding its way through the rural countryside, so it's not easy to police and to manage. But it's become a highly contentious issue during these Brexit negotiations. If the UK leaves the EU customs union, then goods and services would no longer be able to move freely and tariff-free between the north and the south, and that would be a major problem for them.
What are the considerations for Ireland? Is it really a great place for business?
Well, certainly, if you talk to some of my colleagues in Ireland, they'd say absolutely yes. So, I mean, why Ireland? And we got a separate webinar as part of this series on this that goes into this in a lot more detail. But a couple of points of note: 40% of foreign direct investment at the moment into Ireland comes from US companies, so the likes of Intel, Dell, Google, eBay, etc. Ireland offers really generous tax incentives to companies. So I think that, coupled with the fact that it's English speaking by nature, if you like, you've got quite a few companies from the UK that are actually looking to set up, if not subsidiaries, then looking to move headquarters over across to Ireland. Certainly some good reasons for them to do so. But I mean, from Ireland's perspective, Britain remains its biggest trading partner, and business between the two supports something in the region of 400,000 jobs and generates 60 billion euro a year in trade in both directions. So it's something that's of massive concern to Ireland at the moment, and they want to get it right. They know they're in a good position. They know that they have certain incentives that will encourage businesses to come across to them. But if everything falls flat and there is actually no deal struck, then Ireland could actually suffer quite badly.
You know, we thought about it in the States a lot. It was in the news a lot in the 70s and 80s, and the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland was a subject of a lot of political issues, demonstrations, terrorist attacks. That border was eliminated 20 years ago. Does this situation now with Brexit have a risk of increasing tensions between Northern Ireland and the Republic?
Yeah, very, very much so. It's very difficult for those of us who don't actually live in Northern Ireland and don't have the history from Northern Ireland to fully understand and appreciate exactly what their considerations are. Yes, you mentioned, the culmination of the Troubles, as they were referred to, the different factions there with Sinn Féin and the Republican Irish Republican Army, IRA. But that was, that deal brokered by President Clinton, as he was at the time, the Good Friday Agreement. We've just gone past the 20th anniversary of that, and the situation's been fantastic since then. I'm not saying all the tensions have gone; they absolutely haven't. And I think that's mainly the issue: is that the feeling here is that this is way more, I should say, than an economic and a financial situation around what we do with trade. It's actually the political damage that could be created as a result of a hard border being put in place. I don't think anyone's suggesting that it's going to go back to, gun posts and barbed wire fences and things like that. But the very fact of putting a physical border back in place is going to heighten all the tensions again. It's just going to bring them to the surface. So, the Northern Irish in particular are particularly sensitive to this situation. And as I say, it's very difficult to appreciate it without knowledge of that history. In terms of people who cross the border, because it is the only land border between the EU and the UK, you've got something in the region of 30,000 people at the moment who commute daily across the border in both directions, of course. And that excludes the likes of nurses, midwives, etc., who literally crisscross the border as part of their job throughout the day. So there's a lot of people who would be affected by border controls. Add to that the trade surplus that Northern Ireland has with the EU. Can you imagine the risk that's going to be put to if tariffs are actually increased? Certainly, its two biggest markets are going south down into the Republic and of course across into the rest of the UK, or if you look at the map, Great Britain. So there are quite a lot of considerations to make. And one perhaps lighter or fun fact is, one of my favourite drinks, Guinness, the black stuff, brewed in Dublin. What happens then is that it gets put into these tanks called silver bullets, so they're known as, and then they're driven 90 miles over to East Belfast. So they cross the border then into East Belfast where they're canned, and then they cross the border again to go back down to Dublin for distribution from the ports. They will actually have to cross the border twice. And can you imagine the supply chain issues there? and the issues around managing of all the customs tariffs. It'll be quite some fun, especially when it's a drink like Guinness, which is so well known.
Well, we're going to have an exemption. It's going to be the Guinness exemption, right?
I think you're right. I think you're right.
Have double tariffs. That just won't work. So what are their options? What do we have what kind of border options are being discussed?
It boils down to two. So we talked about the different types of customs arrangements on a previous slide, and those electronic trusts that we were talking about, and the use of trusted trader status, which would deal with the regular freight. That's what would be required if you retain the land border, but you impose border checks and border control. So that's option one. Option two is to move those checks to the ports and to the airports. So if you look at the map, you're essentially pushing a line down between Northern Ireland and the rest of Great Britain. You're moving the border essentially into the Irish Sea. Whilst that would mean that the island gets treated the same way as everybody else, it's a bit like, for those who know the UK well, and the border crossing, the crossing of the English Channel between Dover and Calais, it's part of what's called the Le Touquet Treaty. So you would have French border police who sit in Dover, who do French passport checks, if you like, on goods coming out of the UK, and you have English police who sit in Calais doing the same in reverse. That's the same sort of thing that would have to happen in Ireland. Yes, okay, there's no reason why it couldn't happen in principle, but from an Irish perspective, that isolates them. I mean, the clue's in the word United Kingdom. It's part of the United Kingdom. Logically, or from a historical point of view, it's attached to the British Isles in that respect, and they see the kind of a sea border as being the first of their downfall, and the aim to try and sort of incorporate them into the rest of Ireland, which is not what the unionists there want.
Complicated issues, and
completely,
and that leads us to one of the largest is citizens' rights. And we spent a lot of time in the first webinar talking about the 3.2 million native EUs that are residing in the UK right now, and the over 1 million UK citizens that are in the EU, and what will happen to them.
Yeah, well, it hasn't really been resolved, has it? To an extent it has. That's probably not being truthful completely. It's a bit disingenuous. I mean, there has been an agreement that those who are resident when we leave the EU, and I believe that that's essentially now extended to the point of when the transition period finishes in December 2020. So those people who have actually been resident in the EU and qualified will be able to remain with full rights. The actual qualification period before they attain full rights is 5 years, but so long as they're resident before the end of that transition period, that's fine. However, there has still not been any full agreement regarding the members of their extended family. So those people who are resident obviously want to bring their family over, if not now, at some point in the future. That hasn't been decided. So whilst the actual transition period for dealing with regulations, etc., is notionally 2 years, or in fact just slightly less than 2 years to December 2020, there's a period, or qualification period, through which EU citizens who are gaining UK residency can build up, if you like, enough points to qualify for their for their members of their extended family to come across. And I can't remember, it's either 8 to 10 years, something like that. But you can see what's happening. If you talk about a period of time of 8 to 10 years, there's so much water that can go under the bridge between now and then, that is anything actually going to be decided? Is anything actually going to be resolved? It's almost like post-Brexit will happen by de facto. It'll be whatever rules and regulations come in to slightly change things beyond Brexit that will end up being the final situation. As it stands, I think you have. Oh, by the way, sorry, I should say there is one other issue in here. That those people who are qualifying for UK residency, and they were saying they have to be here for 5 years, if they actually leave and then return. And I don't mean just sort of go on holiday or something, but if they actually left the UK and went to another EU country or elsewhere, it doesn't really matter, to live or work for a short while and then come back to the UK, the clock's reset. Everything goes back to zero. So, once you've made a decision, and this would be the same within EU countries as well. Once you've made the decision, you've got to stick to it in order to actually achieve your UK citizen status, if you like. So I kind of see this as being something that is another one of these slight fudges in terms of negotiations. It's a bargaining chip. I think both the EU and the UK know that they will get this issue resolved, but at the moment they're using it as a means to sort of nudge along the negotiations in other areas, whether it be the Irish border, whether it be trade negotiations, especially around the customs union. I think they'll kind of go, well, if you deal with this and say yes to that, then we'll definitely commit to the full citizens' rights issue. I think it's something that's going to happen. It's just that neither side is saying up front because they know it's a contentious issue.
Now, I'm sure you've heard about what's going on in the States related to our immigration issues, DACA, and how we're handling that in the States. I recently heard about this Windrush and had no idea you had any type of situation like that. That's really
Yeah.
muddied the water with your citizens' rights issues.
Yeah, it's a kind of a scandal that's been here for years and years, but it's just erupted recently, absolutely erupted. And this is in the course of the last 2 weeks. So what is Windrush, or what was Windrush? Windrush was actually the name of the vessel that brought over a first set of migrants from the Caribbean, and we're going back as far as 1948. So after the Second World War had finished, the UK, was in a situation, a post-war situation, where its infrastructure was in dire need of assistance, and it had, of course, still part of this British Empire and the colonies out in the Caribbean in particular, and it was offering British citizenship to people from Jamaica, etc. So what happened was that they offered that, and they were offering jobs to people who wanted to come across to the UK. The Windrush was the first boat to bring across the first set of migrants. But it's sparked a fierce national debate, for which the government has actually now officially issued an apology over its treatment of what it's referred to as the Windrush generation, because they were being ordered to prove that they have the right to stay in Britain, even though they've actually been here. Many of them have actually been here for over 50 years. It's an absolutely crazy situation, and I don't think it's one that we can be particularly proud of here. But where's the parallel? I mean, the parallel is that EU citizens who live in Britain now, I mean, they're not, you can't class them the same way as the Windrush migrants, but it's the same issue in that they have to demonstrate that they have a commitment to the UK and that they have permission to stay here under UK rules. But I think the thing that was particularly bad about the whole affair, and it might have a bit of a knock-on effect, is that having been told that they had to prove that they're eligible to stay, that this situation was requested of them, despite it emerging that landing cards recording their arrival dates were actually destroyed in 2010. And this was months after Theresa May, our now Prime Minister, had actually become the Home Secretary. So you can see that now, not only is it the parallel with the EU citizens, but it's also something that's a bit of a political bombshell.
And you talk about political bombshells, navigating through this incredibly complex situation of Brexit, and you wonder if the protest vote would have been any different if everyone before voting really understood the ramifications of leaving. But now you've got Theresa May going through this process, and what type of political ramifications is she getting, and the Conservative Party getting, just because they're the ones right now in the seats for Brexit?
Well, I mean, who'd want to be the British Prime Minister at the moment with this going on? I mean, this is clearly, Mark. This is personal opinion, and you probably get different things, different views from different people. But um, the government has not. I don't think the country has covered itself in glory. I mean, asking a very simple question, such as, "Do you think that the UK should leave the European Union or stay in the European Union?" To my mind, just covered a mass of complexity that I mean, we've just spent however long it is in this discussion going through all the different areas, and you can see that it's such a complex area with a lot of detail behind it. Firstly, nobody knew all of this at the outset, and secondly, I should imagine there's only a very small percentage of the population that could claim to understand it now. So it's a very difficult situation. The second point is it crosses the political divide. So we're run by party politics. It's intrinsically entwined within all the issues around business and trade, etc. But you will find that there is infighting within the inner cabinet, which is the group of people within the UK government that are the kind of the heads of state, the secretaries of, if you like, of different departments who discuss various matters. They can't agree amongst themselves, which is the right position to take. So even on customs partnership, there was a split decision. There are 11 of them on there, and it was a 6-5 split decision during this week regarding their view on the customs partnership. You then go outside the cabinet and to the government, the Conservative government itself, and you start to get a lot of localized feeling, and certainly it's propped up at the moment by the Democratic Unionist Party, the DUP, which is the Northern Ireland Party. Without their support, the UK government doesn't have a majority, and of course their focus is on the Irish border. So withdraw that, the government's in a lot of difficulty. You've then got the UK Parliament itself, and just because the Labour Party is in opposition doesn't mean it takes an alternative view to the Conservatives, and far from it. So you actually have cross-party factions working in Brexit and anti-Brexit groups. Nobody can possibly agree with everybody else. So ultimately what we have to do, and we mentioned it before, you have to keep talking, but you have to have something where there is an agreeable compromise. Are we going to reach that? I don't know. But in terms of particularly the political leaders right now, Theresa May is under fire like she's never been before, especially with her, should we just call it an indirect connection to the Windrush scandal? Being Home Secretary at the time,
Sure.
we had her replacement was somebody called Amber Rudd, and she's had to fall on her sword in the last 2 weeks and resign from cabinet, from government, because of her involvement in it. But really, many people are saying, did she fall on her sword to save Theresa May? Don't know. But it's just another one of these discussion points, which is leading a lot of political commentators to suggest, well, if there's one more thing, it could potentially bring the Tories down. And would the rest of the leading Tory party wait for that point? Maybe they might not. Rather than say, let's not upset things now before we finally leave the EU, maybe we'll actually make a decision now, put in a vote of no confidence, force an election, and have a new leader. All sorts of discussion points could come out there. We could have several hours at it.
It's amazing. I mean, it's the complexities of this, the ramifications of this. In my mind, you're not going to know all of them for years, and there's going to be unintended consequences. Maybe some are going to be positive, but it's fascinating, but it's important information. Again, the reason we're doing these webinars is to have business owners have access to this information and to be able to identify opportunities when investing in Europe and the UK. And it's just an ongoing fluid situation, and really look forward to continuing these dialogues with you, John. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much for this time and this update.
Pleasure. Thank you.